Okay, so Donald Trump. I feel like just saying his name, it kind of gets a reaction out of people.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, he's been front and center in our world for what feels like forever at this point.
Yeah, yeah, constantly in the headlines. But I think there's so much more to the story. Like, if you dig beneath those headlines and, kind of ignore the usual talking points, there's a whole web of events, relationships, allegations, all that kind of stuff that have really shaped his journey. And that's what we're going to be looking at in this deep dive.
Yeah, I mean, like, we're not here to just rehash the same old news cycle.
Right, right. We want to go deeper.
What gets interesting is when you can kind of step back and start looking at some of those foundational things, early influences, patterns that keep popping up. And maybe then we can get a clearer picture of who he is and what he's about.
Okay, so let's rewind all the way back. Let's start with his early life. Growing up in New York, his dad, Fred Trump, was a big name in real estate, built a really successful business. Yeah, and you have to think about that context. That's the environment Donald Trump grew up in. His early experiences, his worldview, how he learned to operate, that all came from that world.
Totally. And it's not like it was all smooth sailing for Fred Trump, even back then.
Oh, right.
There were these allegations of discriminatory housing practices going on within his company, which is something that I think doesn't get talked about as much.
Yeah, and this is important because when Donald Trump steps into the business, it wasn't some blank slate. He joined this existing enterprise with, its baggage, its successes, and its controversies. So that's going to shape you, right? Like, what values did he pick up? What was considered normal business practice? Those are the questions, at least for me.
It makes you wonder. And then, of course, there's this whole story about how much Donald Trump relied on his dad financially. I mean, we all know the small loan of $1 million anecdote. It's almost become a cliche, right?
Yeah, part of the myth, almost. But some reports paint a very different picture, like way more substantial financial support. We're talking potentially tens, maybe even hundreds of millions through loans and inheritance.
Wow. That kind of changes things.
Right, like it challenges the whole self-made billionaire narrative that some people have.
Okay, so let's move into the Trump Organization, his own ventures. And there are sources pointing to some questionable real estate dealings. Like we're talking shady deals, even allegations of money laundering through those luxury properties.
Yeah, and this is where things get murky, right? High-value real estate, unfortunately, can be a way to move dirty money. And the suggestion here is that, some of those luxury developments he built, well, they might have been attractive to buyers who wanted to hide where their money really came from.
And some of those buyers supposedly were Russian oligarchs.
Exactly. That connection keeps coming up.
It does, doesn't it? Okay, and then, of course, there's the Atlantic City casino era.
Oh, yeah. That was a roller coaster.
Huge, glitzy casinos. But then multiple bankruptcies.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that those bankruptcies, they weren't just numbers on a page. They affected real people. Employees lost their jobs, investors lost money. And of course, you have to wonder about how it impacted Donald Trump himself, financially, and his reputation in the business world.
Right, it definitely tarnishes the image of this perfect businessman, doesn't it? And then there's Trump University, which, from what I gather, left a lot of people feeling pretty cheated.
Yeah, that one's rough. I mean, people were promised this education, this path to success, but the allegation is they didn't deliver. They basically misled people, took their money, and while they settled for $25 million without admitting wrongdoing, it definitely makes you think.
Right, and I mean, it wasn't just these big ventures. There was Trump Vodka, the airlines, even Trump Steaks. It was almost like this pattern. Big announcement, big hype, and then flop.
Exactly. And that pattern is interesting. Maybe it tells you something about how he approaches business. Maybe it was more about the brand, the image, than about creating a sustainable, successful product.
Right. It was all about the sizzle. So we've got this businessman, and then he jumps into politics. And I think The Apprentice played a big part in that. It really built up this image of him as like this tough, decisive leader.
Oh, totally. Media shapes how we see people, there's no doubt about it. And The Apprentice told a very specific story about Donald Trump. And that gave him this huge platform, this recognizable identity that he could then use when he moved into politics.
Okay, so fast forward to the 2016 campaign. Things get really intense, really divided.
Yeah.
We see him connecting with Steve Bannon. We see the rise of the alt-right.
Yeah, and those alliances, they resonated with a certain part of the electorate, that's for sure. And it's important to understand why, right? What were the strategies behind those connections? What message was being sent?
And we can't forget all the allegations about misinformation and Cambridge Analytica and how they were using data to target voters.
Yeah, that raised some serious ethical questions about how campaigns operate. I mean, it showed how you could use digital advertising, targeted messaging to maybe sway people with information that wasn't even true.
And then there's Russia, right? Russian interference in the election, the Mueller investigation, that whole thing just cast a huge shadow over everything.
Absolutely. And while the Mueller report didn't find a criminal conspiracy, it did detail all these contacts between the Trump campaign and Russia. And, that raises questions. What were those connections about? Did they have an impact on the election?
Okay, so he becomes president, and those questions about Russia, about his foreign policy, they don't go away, especially his relationship with Putin. That raised eyebrows.
Yeah, there was this closeness, this unwillingness to really criticize Putin, even after, some pretty aggressive moves from Russia on the world stage.
Yeah.
And that, of course, fed right into those existing concerns about Russian influence that had been building since the campaign.
Right, right. And it wasn't just Russia. There were potential conflicts of interest with his businesses, operating in places like Turkey and China.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of presidential ethics is to make sure personal financial interests don't influence foreign policy. And this raised questions about those boundaries. Was he putting his own businesses ahead of the country's interests?
And I think one moment that really sticks out for a lot of people is the Helsinki summit with Putin. The criticism after that was intense, especially when he seemed to contradict U.S. intelligence on Russian interference.
Yeah, that was a big deal. I mean, he basically went against what our own intelligence agencies were saying, and it made people question, what was going on there, what was the nature of his relationship with Putin.
Okay, and then, of course, the impeachment trials. Two of them. The first one was all about that phone call with Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. There were allegations that he was pressuring Ukraine to investigate the Bidens.
Right. The accusation was that he withheld military aid to get Ukraine to dig up dirt on his political rival. And the question was that an abuse of power? Was he using his position for personal gain?
And then the second impeachment was after the January 6th attack on the Capitol.
Right. And that was all about incitement. Did his words and actions lead to that violence? How much responsibility does a president have for their supporters' actions?
Now, through all of this, there was the issue of his tax returns. He fought really hard to keep them private.
Yeah, he broke with tradition there. Most presidents released their returns. And when some of those records did come out, they showed that he paid very little in federal income taxes some years, which didn't really match up with the image he projected of being this super wealthy guy.
Right, and that kind of ties into those allegations that he was, playing fast and loose with property values, inflating them for loans, deflating them for taxes, whatever was convenient at the time.
Right, and that's a big deal. If you're misrepresenting the value of your assets, that can have legal consequences, financial consequences. It depends on the situation, but it's not something you want to be doing.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the people in his orbit, some of the key figures who have also been caught up in controversies. Jeffrey Epstein, for example. That association is something a lot of people find pretty disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, Epstein's crimes were horrific. And even though Trump distanced himself publicly once the allegations came out, that past relationship raises questions. What does it say about his judgment, about the company he keeps?
Right, and then there's Michael Cohen, his lawyer, his fixer for all those years, who then turned on him and became a pretty vocal critic.
Yeah, Cohen's an interesting one. He was an insider. He knew how things work. And his testimony about the Stormy Daniels scandal, the hush money payments, it was very damaging.
Right, and of course, you can't talk about the Trump presidency without mentioning Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. Those accusations of nepotism were pretty constant.
Yeah, I mean, they had these very powerful positions in the White House, despite not having a ton of experience in government. And it did raise questions about, is this appropriate? Is this ethical?
Especially when you consider things like Jared Kushner's ties to Saudi Arabia and that $2 billion investment his fund got after leaving the White House.
Yeah, the timing of that was definitely eyebrow-raising. People were wondering, was there some quid pro quo going on there? Did his White House connections help him secure that money?
Okay, and let's not forget about Steve Bannon and Roger Stone, both hugely influential during the campaign, even if they were often controversial.
Oh, yeah. Bannon's ideology, that nationalist, populist stuff, really fit in with Trump's message. And Stone, he was a veteran political operative. He brought a certain, shall we say, aggressive style to the campaign. And then there was that whole thing with Stone getting convicted and then Trump pardoning him.
Right. It never ends. So we move into the post-presidency, and things haven't exactly calmed down. You have the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago, the classified documents,
Yeah, that was a huge deal. I mean, the accusations are that he mishandled sensitive government information, which is a serious national security concern, and we're still waiting to see how that all plays out.
Right. And the fallout from January 6th is still ongoing. We still don't know the full extent of his involvement in all of that.
The investigations are ongoing, but the question remains, what did he do? What did he know? And what should the consequences be?
And of course, there are all these lawsuits and investigations swirling around him. Even now, it seems like every day there's something new.
Yeah, it's unprecedented for a former president to face this much legal scrutiny. And the outcomes of these cases, they could have huge implications, not just for him, but for the country.
And then there's the whole issue of election denialism, the idea that the election was stolen, which has had a really corrosive effect on our democracy.
Yeah, that's a dangerous path.
Yeah.
When you undermine faith in elections, when you spread misinformation and conspiracy theories, you're really doing damage to the whole system.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at all these alleged hidden connections, all these controversies, and I think it's a lot for people to digest.
It is. And it's important to ask yourself, what does it all add up to? Do you see patterns? Does this change how you view Donald Trump?
Right, and how will he be remembered? Will these controversies define his legacy? Or are there other aspects of his life, his career, that we should be considering as well? I mean, it's complicated. There's no easy answer.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so fascinating, right? I mean, if you were to pick one connection, one allegation that you think is most important in understanding who Donald Trump is, what would it be? What stands out to you?
That's a lot to think about.
It is, but it's important.
Absolutely.
All right, so we'll leave it there for today.
Thanks for listening.
We'll be back next time with another deep dive.
See you then.